Okay, for audio lecture number 2, we're going to talk about the components of language, and they include the following: syntax, morphology, phonology, semantics, and pragmatics. And these items really provide the basis for everything we're going to talk about in our class together and thinking about language development and how in these different components of language, different things are happening at different developmental stages and periods of time. And if we think about language, again, we're talking about a system that is symbolic. It is generative, meaning that it can be combined in lots of different ways. Arbitrary, in the fact that why a cat is called a cat and a horse is called a horse is really no rhyme or reason, but once it is, of course, it has been established, then it needs to be maintained in that way. It's rule governed, meaning that there's a structure to how words and phrases, clauses, and sentences can be put together, that it's a social tool used for communication, and that it's a constantly evolving and changing, and that's a dynamic component that we've talked about in the past. And there are 5 components of language development, which we just talked about. The idea of form, content, and use is something that Bloom and Leahy constructed as an idea quite a number of years ago, and although it's not really where we hang our hats with most of our conversations from a clinical perspective in terms of talking about, am I going to assess his form, or I think he has problems with content. I do think it provides sort of a roadmap for how we think about these different components of language, with form comprised of syntax, morphology, and phonology, with content reflecting actual the actual components of semantics and vocabulary or mental lexicon, and then the use really reflecting pragmatics, or how we're socially using language to communicate with others. And so form, content, and use is how we sort of think about that broader roadmap of language development. So we can begin with our conversation of the components of language talking about phonology. And when we're talking about phonology, we're talking about the rules of language that govern sound and sound patterns. And we will explore this more in depth when we talk about early language development in the first year of life and into toddlerhood and even into preschool. But it's basically, phonology is thinking about all the sounds that children acquire that are specific to their language. And phonemes are the smallest unit of sound that contributes to meaning. And sorry, the phoneme distribution rule should be on its own subsequent line. It just sort of got blended in there. When we think about a phoneme in and of itself isn't meaningful. So if we think about a sound as being the sound b or t, in and of themselves there isn't anything that's tangibly meaningful. But when we combine them with other phonemes into syllables and words and phrases and clauses and so on, that's where meaning comes from. And phoneme distribution rules reflects how sounds can be sequenced. We know in all languages that words need to contain a vowel, and so that's one of those phoneme distribution rules, that something like a vowel always has to be present. We know that in English you can have the sounds st at the start of the word, like in stop, or at the end of the word, as in first. That's a rule that is specific to English, not that other languages couldn't have that same rule, but the phoneme distribution rules indicate or dictate how those phonemes can be combined into meaningful combinations to be able to share ideas, create words, and so on. And then phonological processes is really talking about ways that we can simplify complexity of sound sequences in ways that make it easier for us. And so typically we think about that as for young children. So as we, again, explore further, and I know you've probably spent a lot of time talking about this in other classes that you've had that are specific to phonology, we talk about that children will do specific things to try and simplify the complexity of how sounds are combined in certain words. And interestingly, it's not just children. Adults will also do some sound sequence simplifications that we'll talk about in just a few minutes, and just sort of some colloquial ways that we use words and sounds to be able to share information. So that's sort of the introduction to phonology. It's important to think about the idea that phonemes are sounds, not letters. And sometimes even later in our journey together, I'll hear or see people write about ideas that say that, you know, these are certain letters that children are learning. They're not learning letters. Letters are the orthographic representation of sound. And when we talk about early literacy, we'll reflect upon how those sounds are represented by individual letters and so on. But when we're talking about phonemes, we're talking about individual sounds. And so, for example, ch and th are one sound, so they're only one phoneme, even though they're represented by two letters, and so we have to make that distinction. And I'm sure that your journey with Jen Luan in terms of phonetics, that you've spent some time talking about the phonetic alphabet, but certainly we know that all sounds of languages and the symbols that correspond to them are represented in our International Phonetic Alphabet, and certainly that becomes an important tool that we use as speech-language pathologists to talk about children's speech-sound development. So let's do a little bit of practice with this. When we think about the words below, there are 5 of them: cat, tot, bath, cry, and mine. Go ahead and pause this audio lecture right here and try and sort through how many phonemes are represented in each individual word. What you should have come up with as a result is that there are 3 phonemes in each word. So you can see that despite a number of different letters representing those different sounds in the English language, the actual sounds that they're representing are 3. And I think the word tot is particularly unique as we think about, not unique particularly, but calls people's attention to this idea that you can have a lot of letters that represent an individual sound. And so that becomes important as we move forward and talk about things like phonological awareness and early reading, that you can make that distinction. And lots of people struggle with that early on, especially people who are not trained as speech-language pathologists. So the teachers and sometimes literacy specialists that we talk with and work with don't always understand this difference between phonemes and their sounds and the letters that represent them. We do know that all languages have a limited number of phonemes, and that phonemes have 2 things that are important here. One is allophones, and what we're talking about with allophones is really just a variation of a sound of a phoneme without changing the word's meaning. And so car, door. Those 2 R sounds in those 2 words are quite a bit different, even though they're both a variation of the R sound. I think your text or your notes potentially talk about a word with an F sound, find and phone. So we produce those sounds with a different level of sort of extension of the sound in phone versus find. But again, just 2 variations of the sound phone, the same phoneme, and that's called an allophone. Another thing that's interesting for early phonological development is this idea of categorical perception. And what we're really talking about with this is the idea that we can have people produce words and sounds just a little bit differently, but we have to recognize them as the same. So in that example of fine and phone, those are 2 variations of the same sound, and we need to be able to, as an English language user, know that those 2 sounds are representing the same sound. So it ensures, with categorical perception, it ensures that subtle differences produced or understood to present the same phoneme, and that becomes important. And interestingly, when children are very young, they're able to really hear those 2 different sounds as very distinct. But as they spend more time with their native language and are influenced by the native language and sounds that they're hearing, they start to lose the ability to detect a perceptual difference between phone and fine, because their brains have required them to understand those 2 sounds as the same. If we think about the words like fan and van, the only difference in those sounds is just a voicing error, and voicing in our language, in English, is important because clearly the difference between a fan and a van is really substantial if we think about what those items are. But there could be different languages where those 2 variations don't have a meaningful difference within them, and in those languages, from a categorical perception perspective, they might perceive them as very much being the same. It's really interesting research that talks about categorical perception and how young infants and very early language users learn to categorize these different sounds in meaningful ways. Just sort of what I was just saying, that a small change in a phoneme can really alter meaning in very significant ways. And we've already talked about the phoneme distribution rules. One of the last things I wanted to talk about related to phonology is this idea of phonological awareness, which is within this phonological system, but really connects and really reflects some aspects of manipulating sounds and words and syllables that are important for early literacy. And so we'll hold that conversation until we get to some later chapters that we're talking about preschool and school-age language, because it becomes much more poignant at that point in time. And the last piece is this idea of phonological processes that we've actually already talked about. So we mentioned that there are developmental aspects of use of phonological processes that are very much a part of early language development. And so, for example, very young children are likely to use a phonological process like final consonant deletion, ka for car, mo for more, or consonant cluster reduction, geen for green, cown for clown. And so those are all ways that they're simplifying language to be able to manage it and utilize it and be able to speak it more successfully, because the complexity of those sound sequences are too hard for these early developing immature systems. But we also see that adult users of language also use some phonological processes. So, for example, want to go with me to the movies? Everyone would understand that, but I've really simplified the want to into one single word, wanna, or what you doing. Instead of what are you doing, it becomes a single word. So those are aspects in which just in our day-to-day conversations, we take more complex sound sequences and simplify them in ways that people obviously who are listening can clearly understand. So let's talk now about morphology. Morphology is the smallest unit of language that carries meaning. Example of morphology in this slide is S on the end of chair, chair for chairs, or ED for play for played. And obviously right there we know that one is a plural communication significance, one is past tense ED. And so there's a lot of information that's contained in morphology. And so in terms of what morphology is represented by, morphology has to at least one phoneme in each syllable, and a word is at least one morpheme. And so those are some of the rules that substantiate what a morpheme is. So there are two types of morphemes. There are lexical and grammatical. And lexical morphemes, they cannot be divided into smaller meaningful units. So an actual word is a morpheme. So the word like cat is the smallest unit of meaning. So that can't be divided in any other kinds of ways. And we compare that to grammatical morphemes, which connect to lexical morphemes and modify the meaning. One aspect of a grammatical morpheme is a free morpheme, meaning it can stand alone. To continue with that piece that we were just talking about, so a grammatical morpheme is one that connects to lexical morphemes and modifies the meaning. And so if we have a free morpheme, grammatical morpheme, it can completely stand alone. And so that's a word like cat or dog or any single word that can stand by itself. But if we think about a bound morpheme, it has to connect to something else for it to be meaningful. And so there's two kinds of bound morphemes. One are inflectional morphemes, and they're always attached to the end of words to modify tense or number of possession. So Katie's cat would be an example of possession. I played would be an example of indicating tense. I am playing. ing at the end of words, indicating a difference in when something happened. And where derivational morphology attaches to the beginning or the end of the words. And that's taking a word that has existed and attaching a prefix or a suffix to it.